Hello, and we are live. Welcome to our third episode of Conversations for Change for the year, where we are continuing on our theme about getting serious about policy entrepreneurship. And we're putting a spotlight on blockchain governance, crypto law, and artificial intelligence. And I know it's really exciting for Anya to be doing this topic. Yeah?
It is, it is. I mean, you know me, I've been in this space forever, and today we have a very special guest because I've been following this lady since I began being active in this space. I mean, it's been years, and every single time there has been an article published, I just went there and started downloading and reading all the things that I could. And yeah, I mean, this space is incredibly important, not just because everybody's now talking about the cryptocurrencies and because, you know, the price is going up again. There is so much underlying value that hasn't been properly explored yet. And I'm really glad that there's professors out there and the academics that are pushing towards really opening up the conversations about, well, what is it that this technology, you know, holds for us? And since day one, it's been very clear to me that it's not just the digital coins, the digital currencies that we have out there, but, you know, the smart contracts can really be used for something else as well. And there is these digital organizations that we have and the possibilities that we can implement for improved governance, for example, or automate decision-making processes, and how we can now digitally vote for whatever we want within the organization. Those are all the fascinating things, but yet it kind of is not being explored so much on the market. I think that everybody just heard about these for financial aspects. So yeah, I hope we're going to be addressing these today.
Yeah, because from a governance perspective as well, you know, the transparency and the decentralized nature of the technology can produce so much for us. And so we hope that in this little episode, we could get a better understanding. Those of us like me, I'm going to be the non-techie on the call. I might ask a couple questions for the non-techies, right, as it comes up. But shall we bring in Professor Carla Reyes, and will you do the introduction?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm very pleased to have Professor Carla Reyes with us. She's an assistant professor of law at SMU, the Advanced School of Law. And today, Carla is joining us to discuss the prototype of a smart contract she is creating with Henning Dietrich. I know him as well. There's been this project called Lexon, and it holds a lot. I hope that we're going to be addressing what that kind of means, what type of a programming language there lies. And then we're going to be asking her about the Wyoming regulation, because there's been quite a lot of improvements in that state. And of course, we cannot overlook the latest articles that she's been publishing on the topic of autonomous businesses and the corporate personhood. So I'm really interested whether these AIs are now going to get, you know, passports or ID or what's happening there.
But I would also like us to keep it simple to start, so that we get some definitions around some of the things we're discussing, so that we're not too out there for some people, right? Because, yeah. So welcome, Professor Reyes.
Thanks for having me. So that was a lot. Where would you like me to start, actually?
You know what, maybe we should actually start. What brought you into this space? What inspired you to end up with blockchain and technology and the law, the intersection? That's quite an amazing space to be in.
Yeah, it is. And it was totally by accident. So I graduated law school in 2009. So it was before there were classes like the ones I teach, blockchain law and policy, right? And I started in litigation, of all things. I wasn't even a transactional person. And I was doing privacy and security stuff. And I got pulled over to the transactional side and was doing electronic financial services. So the more traditional stuff, you know, just electronic financial apps, basically, maybe some in-game currencies. And then cryptocurrencies kind of hit the space. And it was originally in the United States governed by the same laws. The first regulators to care were the same regulators that I worked with in the money transmission space for traditional, if you can use that word, electronic financial services. And that's how, so I ended up in the space completely by accident, but around 2011. So really quite early for a lawyer, before there were blockchain groups. And then it's sort of, so Primavera de Filippi says the same thing, but once you're in it, it's so fascinating. You're not going to work on anything else. And so I've been doing it ever since. Yeah.
Wow, 2011, that's very early. I mean, we have to notify everybody that basically blockchain started developing in 2009. That's when the white paper for Bitcoin basically was published, and then everything was just flourishing. And then what can we say, that 2016 was basically the year of the ICOs, when financial markets really started to see the possibility for crowdfunding, and that's where the Security Commission in America actually became very, very attentive to the space.
Yep. And by then I'd already transitioned to academia, and my fellow law professors, I'm writing papers about the first crypto law paper I wrote was around that time, and I'm presenting at conferences, and they're like, "What are you talking about though?" But what are you saying? So yeah, I've been in this space for a long time. But like I said, it's so fascinating. You don't really want to do anything else after that.
I have to ask, does that still happen to you whenever you speak to the regulators or any agencies? Are people still asking you, what are you even talking about? Like, what are the smart contracts?
Yeah, yes. Yep. And indeed, part of the project with that I'm using Lexon for around building a UCC1 form is designed to get at some serious confusion in the literature and among American legal academics about smart contracts. We tend to focus, not me, but the legal academia in the US tends to focus on smart contracts in the question of contract law. Can it be a legally enforceable contract? And most of the time, that's not even what people are using them for. And so no one cares, really. And so part of what this project does is, so I teach secure transactions. My sort of traditional law class is secure transactions. And in the United States, if you take out a secured loan, you have to, if you want to perfect it against other lenders so that you're first in line to reclaim the collateral, you have to file a form called a UCC1 form. And the idea is the form is going to give everybody in the world notice of your property interest in the collateral, that if the debtor goes bankrupt, you're the first to get it to pay off your loan. The problem is the system for giving notice doesn't work very well. It's hard to search. Mistakes are made. Those mistakes usually fall back on the secured party or on the future secured party. It just doesn't work very well. And so I think about blockchain and its use cases as being most helpful when people are having a hard time coming to an agreement about the evolution and existence of shared facts between them, particularly when they don't trust each other and there's no like one person that can tell them the truth, right? So when a whole bunch of people need to agree on what the truth is, blockchain is a helpful tool to help do that. And that's what's happening in the UCC1 filing context. And the notice doesn't work well because no one can tell what the truth is. And so the idea from about 2016 has been, well, maybe we could use blockchain and smart contracts to help fix the system, to make it work the way that it was supposed to. And I wrote a paper back then called Conceptualizing Crypto Law that suggested this, but back then I couldn't do it. I'm not a programmer. I don't know how to build the thing. Although a professor on Twitter challenged me to do so. And so ever since I've been trying to figure out how. I tried having computer science students build it for me, and that didn't quite go very well. But around the same time, Henning Diedrich was building Lexon. And I remember he was giving me comments on that paper, Conceptualizing Crypto Law, and I was giving him comments on the first Lexon white paper way back when. And now that it's up and running, like functional, I can, in fact, build this form out of smart contracts that I've been hoping to build since for forever. What is that, 4 years now? It's a long time in crypto land, right? And so we finally, I have a prototype that I coded in Lexon. It probably is buggy still. But Lexon is very rapidly evolving and getting better. And so it won't be long before it's really a fully functioning, you could use it in production system. But really the goal is to prove that you can use smart contracts to build this form. And it's a form, it's not a contract, right? So it busts the myth. Like you can't look at what I've built and be like, oh, that's a legally enforceable contract. No, it's a form. The thing that we use right now is a PDF fillable form. It has nothing to do with contract law, right? So just by building the thing, I've sort of stuck a pin in this. Well, the only thing that's important about smart contracts is if it's a contract or not. No, it has nothing to do with that, right? So just by building it, I've sort of dispelled that myth. And then I want to prove that we could actually use it. And there are a couple of states considering using it, which is fantastic. But yeah, so I'm still sort of writing up the paper that goes with it, because it's harder to talk about building something than I had expected it to be. It's just not the paper I write normally, but I'm working on it. Like literally today, that's what I'm working on. But yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just would like if we could get some definitions so that people who don't really understand a lot about the space could try to follow along with what you're talking about, Carla. So when we're talking about blockchain technology, what is it?
Sure.
Yeah.
So blockchain technology is a specific type of distributed ledger technology that uses the data structure of a blockchain is literally a chain of cryptographically linked blocks of data, which essentially tracks transitions in state, which is a bunch of words that also need defining. But if you can imagine that like your computer has state, it just means like the set of facts that it knows to exist right now, right? And then like you're using Word document and you write some words, now the state has changed. What a blockchain does is just track the transitions in state in this like basically global world computer, essentially. People liken it to a ledger. That's where the distributed ledger analogy came from. But technically distributed ledgers aren't blockchains, right? A blockchain is a specific kind. Distributed ledger is the umbrella term used, but you could have a distributed ledger that tracks transitions in state that does not use cryptographically linked blocks of data, right? So a blockchain has a specific data structure, which is why it's literally a chain of blocks, which is why it's called a blockchain. But the goal, as I said, of a blockchain or a distributed ledger is to allow untrusting parties, people who don't know each other, to agree on the evolution and existence of shared facts between them, so that we can all trust that the ledger, that it says what it says, and that everybody has the same copy of the records. That's what blockchains are.
Yeah, that decentralization of the information almost instantaneously, I think, is what gets people excited, particularly from the governance perspective. One last question. What are the use cases you see for this type of technology? Because I've heard of it in the context of increasing transparency and effectiveness in voting systems, and also in public procurement and supply chain management. Could you tell us a little bit about where you think the best use cases
all over the place then?
So I'm a little harder on the supply chain management use case than many people are, because I don't think it's useful, but because I think they overpromise a lot. So in the supply chain management context, what you're really doing, like, so I don't know, the big examples are the Walmart mango video, right? We can trace the provenance of the mangoes right back to the tree. Well, sort of, right? What you can do is input data onto the chain, and then you can update the data. And what the end, and you're still trusting the people that put the data into the blockchain, right? You're still trusting the inserters of the record. But what the blockchain does for the supply chain space is the same thing as basically like registered mail for mail, right? You can tell no one has altered the records after they've been put into the chain, right? That you can tell. What you can't tell is whether the person who entered the data was telling the truth, right? So there's a limit on just how far the promises of blockchain for supply chain can go. It doesn't mean so, and I'm pretty hard on them sometimes in class. And I have students who are from the business supply chain space, and they're like, yeah, but Professor Reyes, that's a big deal. Like, you don't seem to understand how far behind supply chain is exactly, right? Yeah. I'm like, oh, well, that's true. Then fine. Like, I can get behind that. But some of the commercials maybe for supply chain solutions promise a lot more than that. And I don't really think it gets more than like registered mail for supply chains. Yeah.
Since you mentioned the students and being the professor, there is a really good question that came up a couple of weeks ago on Stanford conference, and that is, how do you even create a curriculum for something that changes so fast? Like, before you even end up with the whole lecture, the thing might already be changed on the internet. So how do you create that?
Yeah, so my class, a lot like the folks who spoke on the panel that day, the first 3 weeks of class, I make them dig into the tech. So they read Professor Narayanan's computer science textbook, and they're law students, so they think that's a little intense, but they are grateful for it later. So they read Professor Narayanan's textbook on like how the stuff works, because I think a lot of the legal issues that people often don't understand really depend, at least in the United States, on what we call the facts and circumstances tests. And they're very detail oriented. And so the way the tech works can change the way the law applies or not, right? You might be in the box or out of the box just based on the way the technology works. And so having students really understand the technology at a deeper level is really important. So the first 3 weeks or so is just tech. And then for legal purposes, the second or the fourth week is about like the old school cyber law debates, like how do we approach this field in the first place? Should there be a law of blockchain, like a cyber law? Is it just another law of the horse, right? Because I want them to have this bigger picture of the argument between, you should leave us alone. Nothing on the blockchain is regulable. It's its own jurisdiction, right? Those debates that happen, which were true for the internet too, right? Versus we regulate activity and we don't care if you are doing it on a blockchain or via the internet or on paper. If you do this, that's in the box. And if you don't, then it's not. So that's the fourth week. And then after that, we go through a series of topics. I have my favorites that I always include. And then the rest, I let the students choose. So if they have a particular interest that I'm not, I just don't otherwise think about, then we add it in. So this year it was insurance, for example. I had several students really interested in blockchain and insurance. But in terms of keeping up to date, so yeah, you have to check the night before your lecture to make sure you need to update something. But then I also just use technology to keep students updated. So after we do securities regulation, for example, there's always something to add. So I have a Slack channel. And so I keep my students up to date via Slack with regulatory developments and articles from the press. And then it has the benefit of pointing them in the right direction themselves. So if they want to know what industry is doing, they know where to go look, which is because not for blockchain, it's not always the same places as normal legal research would happen, right? But yeah, so that's part of it, is just develop other ways outside the classroom to help keep them up to date, because you can't cover everything, obviously, in a semester. So yeah.
Well, same question goes actually for the policymakers. You previously mentioned that a couple of the states in America are actually looking into the direction of implementing, for example, solutions utilizing the blockchain technology. But how is that being achieved? Is it, you writing a lot of articles and then proposing to them, hey, you should really read these, and then figuring out through that? Or is it one-on-one conversations that you have to hold, roundtable discussion? How is that happening?
So it's actually coming from industry often. It's either industry or a really interested academic who's sort of uniquely tied to the state. So in Texas, for example, its industry has put together something called the Texas Blockchain Council, and they have their own ideas about what laws need to change. And then they reach out and say, hey, we're interested in this issue. Do you have thoughts, right? And then they put together a group of legal experts, both practitioners and academics, to talk about it and then to make proposals to the legislature. And I think something similar happens in Wyoming, although Wyoming has their select committee on blockchain and finance, which is a uniquely organized group of experts themselves. And they have their own sort of legislative priorities. But then Arizona, I understand, is a lot like Texas. They have a sort of unique council, a group put together by industry themselves that is thinking about how can we make changes to the law, to benefit, to attract. It's often about how do we attract business to our state, right? But yeah, that's how it's been happening.
This is pretty fascinating, because there's really not a lot of countries that would have lex specialis for blockchain. Or even a working group that really is devoted to research this specific area. What do you think draw them towards? What was the underlying need for that?
For why are these things forming? You mean, why are these groups forming? I think because they weren't sure how else to to get the issue in front of the legislature, right? Particularly, a couple of them have sprung up this year. So I think particularly in the face of other policy priorities like COVID, if you want something like this on the agenda, then you need to, have a force to help you get it in front of people. And I think that's part of it. I also just think that's the nature of a lot of lawmaking at the state level in the United States. I don't think it's terribly unique. I would say at the federal level recently, and I'm not sure I want to comment on the substance of them, but recently we've seen several academics work very closely with particular legislative members of the federal Congress to propose specific legislation around like a specific issue. I'm thinking of the Stable Act, for example. And I don't know how normal that is, like how often that's the way that would happen, but it seems to have happened in this context. And it may just be that those of us who have the time to research and work on it full time are, you come to ask questions about these particular things. I'm not sure, but.
Would you say that there's a great need to regulate this space? What are the risks associated with blockchain technology and not regulating this space?
Yeah, so at least in the United States, it's super regulated already. So most of my work is about trying to help regulators and lawmakers and even my colleagues just understand that this idea that it's not regulated at all, I think a lot of people call it the Wild West. It's not the Wild West. There's a lot of regulatory requirements that are applied to anyone in this space. And a lot of what I try to do, I want to differentiate between the layers of the technology stack. I am really a big proponent of keeping regulation away from the protocol layer. I think open source code should be allowed to continue to develop just like open source code has always been allowed to continue to develop. The fact that it's a blockchain versus something else, I don't actually care, right? Like we don't put, I think it should just continue to be treated the way it always is. Somehow though, people are like, but it's money and that's different. No, it's not though, right? So it's not that different. It's still an open source protocol that like it's doing at base what the internet does for information. It is giving machines the instructions to talk to each other in order to achieve a specific thing. I don't think that needs to be regulated. The activity that people conduct on it, however, may need to be regulated. And so I'm a big proponent for activities-based regulation. And most of that activity, it happens where I would say like at the second or third layer of the technology stack. So when we look at ICOs, for example, that's the second layer, right? Those are non-native tokens, usually issued by a issuer, right? By a centralized party. And so a lot of the talk about, well, if it's decentralized, then we shouldn't regulate it. But if it's centralized, we should. I have yet to see maybe one, I can think of one off the top of my head, actual decentralized token, right? Tokens are, just because they run on decentralized rails doesn't mean that the token itself is decentralized, right? And so it's the activity, I think. And you have to be able to discern the activity from the technology, which is why I make my students study the technology for almost a month before we ever look at legal stuff, because otherwise it all gets messed up.
This is exactly where you became my hero. There was an article that you wrote about the decentralization, and I struggled so much just explaining to people that if somebody claims to be decentralized, it's not merely like enough to say that. That's way too general to just put it that way. It really depends on what level of decentralization they are, or which of the infrastructure layer is in fact decentralized. And just like you said it, I mean, it really depends. And I think those are the basic questions that we need to understand before we even start regulating or thinking about how to approach as a regulator to this field. This was kind of connected to the questions that we also had in Slovenia, because like the regulator or the agencies became very much aware of the field because of the taxes, because of the profits that people were making. But it wasn't just that, now that the ICOs are making so much profit, let's tax the profit. It was also about, well, where is this profit actually being made? And it really became clear that we need to first understand what is the activity that the issuers or the people dealing with crypto are actually conducting, so that based on the activity, we actually proposed, well, this is the tax that need to be applied, and this is the tax rate, and this is when the event is going to be taxed, and etc. So there's so many different buzzwords, or just ideas around this space. And in the latest article, you even mentioned that there is usually two opponents that have their very strong opinions which clash, and then unfortunately we actually end up with a space that is not really being explored much. Like, there's a gap between these people. And when I entered the space, the first thing that I noticed was that on one side you had developers, on the other side you had philosophers and lawyers, and both of these types of people wanted to talk about one single thing, and that was smart contract. But they were just mentally on two different islands. And it was like, okay, first let's create the bridge and let's fill up the gap and let's find out what it is that we have in common and where our mindsets are really differing.
Exactly. And it's usually the group in the middle that either needs attention, like maybe that's actually where some of the problems are, or it's the place where you can point out, look, the thing you're worried about over there, that's not realistic right now. To say the technology, that's not what's happening. Focus on this middle group where people are actually building stuff, and see if you actually have any concerns. But most of the time, what I find is the concerns that I see in that middle group where people are building stuff isn't actually about the technology. It's the other way around. So I talk to my students a lot about how I see the law and technology as a magic mirror. So yes, on the one hand, we have to apply law to the technology, but on the other hand, the technology is going to reflect back to the law where it's messed up, right? Where it's not achieving the goals that we had intended for it to achieve. And usually that's that unexplored space in the middle where nobody's paying attention to what's actually happening on the ground. If they did, they'd see like new lessons for the law and more broadly, like for the regular world, not for crypto law, right? Yeah.
And I guess that came up, and that comes up in artificial intelligence all the time, especially now with the facial recognition issues that are coming up. The technology is reflecting back to us, what was already wrong in our society and how we can do better.
Yeah, exactly.
You also teach in that area, artificial
intelligence. I do.
intelligence.
Yeah, I'm teaching it right now, actually, artificial intelligence in the law.
And go on, Anja,
sorry, there's an article that I love. It's called Autonomous Business Reality. And you mentioned in it that the issue of proxy and how it's not transparent might be actually because of the biases, or because that's where the interest of all the corporate people are. And that this is why the regulation is not really changing, or why the technology is not being adopted, which is kind of sad to some extent. But do you believe that we can incentivize corporate people or different stakeholders with appropriate regulation in this space as well?
They do. I actually think the incentivization is going to lie in the more people move towards technology-based organizations, I think. So the more LLCs that use DAOs, for example.
Wait. Let's first explain what DAOs are.
Sure. So decentralized autonomous organizations, essentially business organizations run through code, but often it's not the fact that they're run through code that makes them unique. It's the way they restructure the way we think about managing business activity. So traditionally, managing business activity requires separating ownership and control. The shareholders own the company, but the managers control it. And then you have the agency problem. That's why we have fiduciary duties, et cetera, because you can't make the managers do what you want most of the time. And there's really no good way for shareholders to have input. Well, using decentralized autonomous organizations, you can flatten the corporate governance curve, right? You can collapse essentially the gap between the shareholders and the management. You can do that either by creating an LLC and having it be member managed entirely through the code, which makes it faster, easier to participate, et cetera. Or you can, and I think Professor Lepecki has proven quite well that at least in the United States, you can create corporations under existing law operated by computer code, that it's flexible enough to achieve it. And if you did that, then you, he says, you just don't have a board of directors, for example, and it's shareholder run. And that is a serious collapsing of ownership and control in the traditional corporation that people haven't thought about before, right? At least not extensively. And so, yeah, I think the more those kinds of things happen, the more that the technology shows, even within the existing types of business entities, that you can be creative, that this gap between ownership and control isn't necessary. It's just a function of the way we've done it for forever. I think that will incentivize more even than the law, but just being creative, like, I guess, using the technology to hack the existing law, right? That being creative within your existing legal forms will cause incentivizations and changes in more traditional companies, unless they want to fall behind. I mean, but it has to, I think it's a prediction that's pretty far out there for the future. Like, it's going to take a lot, like a mass of creative companies to push the traditional incumbents to do something different. But I think it's possible.
Can you imagine, Margaret, having Apple or being employed by an AI, having a human above you, and just, yeah, I'm speaking to a robot. Okay, your tasks for today are okay.
One of the applications, and it came up at the summit that we hosted last year, was about having an AI person on your board that was responsible for protecting the earth and collecting all of that data in terms of what's happening with the earth and what is your company's footprint, and having that AI person on the board actually have a vote on decisions that are making. So yeah, AI is really, yeah,
there's a lot there for the US. There's an increasing, at least, possibility of like a duty of cybersecurity, a fiduciary duty of in cybersecurity. And so then the question becomes, how soon after that, before there's a fiduciary duty to at least use AI?
Right.
So so one of the things you have to be fully informed before you take a decision, and to be held accountable to that, you have to hit gross negligence, which is a pretty, like, that you have to do something pretty bad, right? But how long is it before not consulting the AI tools that are available to you is gross negligence, right? And then it's part of your duty of care. You have to, maybe it doesn't have to be on your board, maybe it doesn't have to have a vote, but you have to at least go use the tool as an available research tool before you make your decision. I think that's probably the next closest step to fiduciary duties in AI.
It makes sense. Before, we just mentioned that the technology is going to be mirroring our own societal, changes, or not even changes, but really just the behavioristic patterns. And it's going to be showing us where we kind of lack or have the biases, the unknown unknowns. So being able to reveal those and being able to make better decisions, it makes perfect sense to be obliged to actually use AI whenever we are forming decisions. Wow, I thought the Skynet scenario is going to be the one that we're going to be talking about, but this is actually a completely different way to go about. I mean, Skynet is like, okay, if I don't even have the switch control, if I can't shut down the robots or whomever is making decisions, that's one thing. I know that Metronome, for example, went into that direction, but it's really more or less about a combination of a human element and a robot or algorithm element.
Yeah.
Democracy, all right. That's fascinating. Margaret, do you have any last questions? Because I know I'm going to be a bit mindful of the time. I know we said 30 minutes and we never actually end up with 30 minutes. We always extend that time. It's always that we are hosting such a fabulous guests that I would just continue the conversation, and I hope that we're going to be having a pleasure to actually host you once again in the future. But yeah, any final questions, or do we have any questions from the audience, for example?
I haven't seen any questions from the audience, and people are thanking for the resources that we have been putting in the links, because Carla, we've been sharing your papers as you've been mentioning something. We've been linking your papers for people, and they've been really grateful for that. Oh yeah, we do have a question. Let's see. Steve says, can you give us some more information on an AI sustainability non-executive director, please? That's what you mean by that, Steve? Ned?
That's a broad question that could take another 30 minutes, maybe. But I could certainly send materials for you to post later if that would be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And Steve, you can plug into our platform where we host all of the recordings from the summit. And there was a dedicated lecture on this specific topic. I think that's what I was referencing. A non-executive director or a director with voting rights on your board doing the AI. Yeah, Marina would love to learn more about DAO law in Wyoming.
Yeah, we haven't addressed that, at least not in details, yeah.
So I can send the draft law that they're considering, if that's helpful. It's available on their website. They're very transparent about their process. So it's available on their committee, what is it called? The Select Committee for Blockchain Finance something. But on their website, the draft law is available. And what's really cool, I think, about their approach is that they are amending directly the LLC, the existing LLC law, rather than creating a new law altogether. So like Vermont created the blockchain-based LLC and they sort of revamped the whole thing. They started from scratch and tried to come up with new approximate rules for having a DAO with a legal wrapper. But in Wyoming, they're just amending portions of the existing LLC law rather than creating a whole new thing. And so what's been cool has been to see folks like Aaron Wright and his students, who are primarily the research people behind it, and drafting the proposed amendments, and work with folks like experts at the University of Wyoming Law School, Professor Matt Coffin, who focuses solely on LLC law, but knows nothing about DAOs, right? So it's been really cool to watch them work together to make sure that the amendments to the LLC piece don't interfere with the continued operation of regular LLCs, which would be a terrible outcome, right? You want to enable something new without causing harm to the existing system. They call it the first law of legal reform: do no harm, right? So don't mess up the existing stuff. But they're trying to create a system where the smart contracts can operate as your as the agreement. So you still have to file an articles of formation, for example, but then the membership agreement can be via smart contract and only via smart contract if you want. And there's like two separate tracks, one for smart contracts that can't be amended and another for smart contracts that can be sort of updated, which I personally would recommend. I want to be able to update my code the same way that I would update the actual agreement over time. But yeah, that's a brief overview. But I think they're doing something super cool by just trying to amend the regular LLC law.
Wow, you just mentioned the immutability of all the smart contracts. And then another question that I have is the membership, because basically what blockchain brought to us is the anonymity of all the parties that kind of interact between each other. And then whenever we looked into the membership structures and how, for example, the existing laws could apply to DAOs, the problem always was that we needed to reveal the identity of the parties that kind of created this foundational agreement. And in the LLC Vermont, for example, or Wyoming, is that allowed now? Are parties allowed to be anonymous and yet form an organization that is going to be recognized by the law, or how does this work?
So I think it's actually that someone needs to know the list of members, but not that the whole world does, right? So there has to be someone who you can go to say, this is the list of members. And mostly for civil suit, right? Because you have to be able to sue them, and you have to be able to comply with things like OFAC and sanctions laws. You can't have folks on sanctioned countries be part of your company that way. So that's really what it's about. But I think the rule is now, like, at least some designated person, maybe the registered agent, has to know. But the whole world, like, you don't have to make a public list necessarily. Which is different than in other business forms. But at least for the LLC, it's always been the most flexible form. And so it's not surprising that this would be the tech that you take to have allow, right? A legal autonomous organization, which is another cool thing. They're going to, you have to have LLC or Inc. after the company name. So now in Wyoming, it'll be LAO, legal autonomous organization. Cool. Yeah, I think it's cool.
Law constantly developing. We do have another semi-question. Is it? Please expound on the different types of liabilities under ownership of AI, investor, programmer, and user. Of the three different levels, who's most liable when AI commits a breach?
Wow. So that's a lot too.
Paying for that advice.
Yeah, so what I say, I'm just a researcher. Remember, now I'm not a practicing attorney anymore. So there's that. But I think that just depends on what area. So what area of the law you're talking about. So there's this really great paper from Brian Choi. He's at Ohio State University, I think. But I think the paper is in the Washington Law Review. It's called Crashworthy Code. I'm going to teach out of it in like a week, maybe. And it focuses on tort law. And it says, look, part of the problem for tort law, it's mostly about software generally, not just AI, but part of the problem for tort law is something called the economic loss doctrine. If all you're doing is losing money, you usually doesn't count. And there's a little bit of an echo, sorry, but his argument is code always crashes. And we should maybe, that's the other thing, it's not usually under product liability either. Software is usually accepted out of product liability requirements. And so his argument is, look, code always crashes. We expect it to crash. The question is, who is liable when it crashes? And he says, we've seen this problem before. And I think it's the coolest example. I love taking old paradigms and putting them on new stuff. So he says, we've seen this problem before when we started regulating automakers. He said, back in the day, when people drove, there was no contributory negligence, right? It was always the driver's fault. Always the driver's fault. I mean, the manufacturer said, well, cars crash. That's what they do. And eventually the law decided, yes, cars crash. That's what they do. So we're going to require you to take mitigation measures. You have to include seatbelts. You have to, change the angle of the steering wheel so it doesn't ram into their chest, right? You have, whatever it is. And that's how we started to see safety features in the cars. And so he says, in this paper, Crashworthy Code, we should make code crashworthy. We should expect that it will have bugs, because it will. We should expect it to crash, but we should build in mitigation systems. The law should require building in mitigation systems. And then if you purposely do not build in mitigation systems, then you should be able to be held liable, right? And that's the proposal. But otherwise, it's quite the law of AI liability is in a bit of flux. There's also really great papers from Mihalis Demian, I don't know how to say his last name, Demiathis, he's from Iowa Law School, and he writes on corporate criminal responsibility. And so he's been investigating what happens when corporations do criminal things, but they did it because they were relying on information from AI, right? So predictions or knowledge, maybe models, knowledge that they wouldn't have otherwise have if they weren't using an AI tool. And the question is, for criminal purposes, does that count as knowledge, right? Is that part of the mens rea? Can we hold the corporation responsible the normal way we would if what they're using is essentially AI crunching big data to tell them what to do? And again, that's a sort of advanced, sort of cutting edge topic, but that's really, as a researcher, that's where I am now. I'm not in the thick of it anymore when it comes to those particular issues.
It seems now the questions are coming in a rage, but we are going to have to bring it to a close. But maybe I could ask you as a final question, for any lawyers or professionals out there who are listening in, who don't understand much about the blockchain, but they have a deep sense that, this is something they want to learn more about, they want to get involved in, and they want to be able to shape how blockchain is addressed in their jurisdictions. We have quite a broad sort of demographic of people all over the world who tune into what we're doing, not just in the US. So what advice would you give to a professional like that who wants to get involved? What are the first steps? I love what you said about your students. You take them for a month and they need to focus on the technology itself. But what would you advise someone wanting to get into this field and understand more and see how they could leverage it?
Yeah, so the first thing is to understand the technology, I think. And I fully recommend Professor Narayanan's textbook. It's called Bitcoin and Other Cryptocurrencies, I think. And it's just fabulous. It's accessible. It is a computer science textbook, and some of it's a little technical for the non-computer science person, but it's really, really accessible. So that's a good starting place. Also, Ethereum as a book by Henning Dietrich, that I think is quite accessible. It was one of the first books about Ethereum. For smart contracts, I highly recommend the Lexon books. I love them very much. It's what I use. The Lexon Bible is the one that I use to build my prototype, literally just flipping through the pages to figure out how to do it. And then from there, so for me, the way when I'm interested in a new topic, so I know the technology, that's fine. But when I'm interested in a new like commercial law application of blockchain, so then I go and do a deep dive in like, what are people doing in that space, right? So if you are a commercial law person, one thing would be to take a look at the Unidraw efforts on private law and digital assets, right? So there's a working group at Unidraw. Uncitral is doing one too. This commercial law piece is finally getting some attention. It's maybe one of the more underdeveloped parts in the United States. If you do happen to be from the United States, join as an observer. The Uniform Law Commission and American Law Institute project on the UCC. And help us out. We need help. Help us out. But yeah, join figure out what's going on in your space, whatever angle it is that you're interested. I would recommend not trying to like cover the whole thing. I definitely think of myself as a business, commercial law, and blockchain AI person, right? I'm not the criminal stuff that Mihalis does. That's not me. The tort liability stuff that Brian Choi does. That's not me, which is why I went to their stuff to tell you the answers, right? So pick your piece of it and like carve it off and do a deep dive there. And you'll start to pick up little pieces where it touches on other areas. But really, that's about all you can manage. If anybody in the space tells you they know everything about all of it, they are lying to you or to themselves. So pick your little piece and take a deep dive there. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. I think that's so helpful. That is so helpful. And we are going to be putting all of these resources in the links under this. Thank you for all of those resources.
Yeah.
Some of them have already been posted as a comment, but yeah, we're definitely going to be collecting all the resources. Also, we're going to be sharing the resources for the next upcoming masterclass on blockchain law, policy, and practice. It's coming up on 20th of February, so sign up if you haven't yet. It's going to be 90 minutes plus 30 minutes of another conversation like such. I hope you enjoyed this one today. Carla, thank you so much for coming up and spend this time on Saturday with us. I very much thank you for that. And I hope to see you once again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carla. And we hope to continue these conversations as we go forward. For the masterclass, guys, masterclass.futurelaw.io, February 20th. For those of you who, like me, are still like, what is that? How does this apply? This is where you go for the 101, step-by-step, what it's about, what are the risks, why it's important today. So check it out. Thanks for joining, guys.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.